You are looking at a case file 44 years in the making. 11 names sit inside it, along with dozens more the record never officially connected. For most of that time, the file held a description, a pattern, and almost nothing that could be proven in court. But the answer was never missing. It had been sitting inside an ordinary public database the entire time, filed under someone else's identity, waiting for a question no one had thought to ask yet. Between 1974 and 1986, a series of home invasions, sexual assaults, and homicides spread across California. The pattern began in Sacramento County, in quiet suburban neighborhoods where residents had never thought to lock their back doors. It moved into the East Bay. It resurfaced, years later, further south in Orange County, shifting enough in geography and method that separate police departments spent years working what looked like separate cases. Investigators gave the offender 3 different names before they understood they were chasing one person: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. 3 task forces worked the same man for years without realizing it. 3 different names filled 3 different filing cabinets in 3 different counties, compiled by detectives who had no reason to call one another. Only later, once the surviving records were finally compared side by side, did anyone see how much overlap had been sitting there unexamined the entire time. What does it take to convict a pattern that no one has connected yet? For the communities living through those 12 years, the case was not an abstraction. Entire neighborhoods changed their habits. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Local news carried the story for weeks at a time, then years, as the geography shifted and a new jurisdiction inherited the same unanswered question the last one had been unable to close. Detectives retired without an arrest. New detectives inherited the same 3 case names and the same unresolved profile, sometimes without realizing how many of their predecessors had already tried and failed. What does it cost a community to live for over a decade without an answer? Long before DNA offered any answers, investigators leaned on behavioral analysis, studying the timing, the entry methods, and the geographic discipline of each offense for anything consistent enough to narrow the search. The behavior was methodical and controlled enough to suggest law enforcement or military training, a theory investigators kept returning to for decades. It would take another branch of science entirely, and another 40 years, to confirm they had been right about that all along. Forensic evidence existed almost from the beginning. Crime scene technicians in the 1970s collected biological samples using the tools of the era: swabs, sealed slides, containers logged under a strict chain of custody. The unbroken paper trail proving that a piece of evidence has not been altered, lost, or contaminated between the moment it is collected and the moment it is tested. What investigators lacked was a way to read what they had preserved. DNA profiling did not exist yet as a forensic tool. It would take another decade to arrive. By the mid-1990s, crime laboratories could generate an STR profile, a short tandem repeat profile, a genetic fingerprint built from specific short sequences of DNA that repeat a different number of times in every individual. 2 people will almost never share the same repeat count across enough of these sequences to be confused with one another. Analysts built a profile from the preserved evidence and ran it against CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national repository of profiles collected from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes. The results connected crimes across 4 counties that had never officially been linked. They also confirmed something investigators had feared for 20 years. One person, not several, was responsible for all of it. Reaching that profile in the first place required clearing a separate forensic hurdle: Biological evidence that has sat in storage for over a decade degrades. It breaks down into fragments too small on their own for any instrument to read reliably. To work around that, analysts rely on a process called amplification, most commonly a technique known as polymerase chain reaction, which copies the surviving fragments of DNA millions of times over until there is enough material to produce a stable, readable profile. Without that step, the sample sitting in evidence since the 1970s and 1980s would have remained biologically present, but practically unreadable, degraded past the point of use before the technology needed to interpret it had even been invented. The profile matched no one already in the system. For the next 2 decades, the case existed in an unusual state. Solved on a forensic level, since one confirmed genetic identity now tied every crime scene together. Unsolved on every practical level, since a profile with no name attached convicts no one. Cold case investigator Paul Holes inherited the file partway through that stretch and refused to let it go cold in practice the way it had gone cold in the press. He spent more than 20 years on it, long after most departments would have quietly reassigned the file elsewhere, aware of exactly what the evidence could prove and unable to make it prove anything further. In 2016, true crime writer Michelle McNamara published a body of research under a title that would eventually define the case in the public imagination: I'll Be Gone in the Dark. It was McNamara who gave the offender the name that stuck, the Golden State Killer, replacing 3 fragmented aliases with one. She would never see what that name led to. She died in her sleep later that year, and her manuscript was completed posthumously by her research partners, reaching bookshelves in February 2018. 10 weeks later, the case broke open. Not because of a new sample, because of a new use for the old one. What changes a cold case into a closed one if the evidence itself hasn't changed at all? Around 2017, investigators turned to a technique that had not existed when the file was first opened: investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than testing the crime scene sample against a criminal database again, they converted it through SNP profiling, a method that reads hundreds of thousands of single-letter variations scattered across the genome, instead of the small handful of repeating sequences an STR test measures. That richer profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy platform built for ordinary users tracing their own family history, not for law enforcement investigations. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter was brought in to interpret the results. The crime scene profile matched no one directly. It matched distant cousins, third and fourth cousins, sharing only a small fraction of DNA with the unknown suspect, measured in centimorgans, the unit geneticists use to estimate how much DNA 2 people share, and, from that, how closely related they likely are. Most of those distant matches had no idea their ancestry results carried any connection to a criminal investigation at all. From that faint genetic thread, Ray Venter began reconstructing family trees backward, generation by generation, cross-referencing birth records, marriage records, and obituaries, searching for the single branch where those distant relatives converged with a man who fit the case's age, geography, and 12-year timeline. The trees narrowed a pool of millions of Californians down to a small handful of men. One of them was a former police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., dismissed decades earlier from a prior department for shoplifting, living since then in ordinary suburban obscurity not far from several of the original crime scenes. A genealogical hypothesis is not evidence. Investigators needed a direct, confirmatory match, and they needed it without alerting a man who had evaded identification for over 40 years. So they waited. Under what is sometimes called the abandoned DNA doctrine, a person forfeits any reasonable expectation of privacy over an item once they discard it, which allows law enforcement to collect and test that item without a warrant. Investigators recovered a discarded item from outside D'Angelo's home. It matched the crime scene profile directly. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old. 44 years had passed since the first entry in the file. The forensic conclusion took 2 more years to become a legal one. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and, as part of the agreement, formally admitted to dozens of additional sexual assaults across the state that had already passed their statute of limitations for prosecution. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. What the DNA evidence had proven in 1994, one identity behind one continuous series of crimes spanning a decade and 4 counties, the genealogy finally proved by name in 2018. Paul Holes, who had carried the file for so long, was present at the arrest. He would later leave law enforcement, co-host a podcast built around the cold cases he had spent his career chasing, and appear in the HBO documentary series adapted from McNamara's book, a project she had not lived to see finished either. The technique that closed this file did not stay contained to it. Investigative genetic genealogy has since been credited with identifying suspects and unidentified victims in hundreds of other cold cases, some considerably older than this one, including decades-old homicides and long unnamed Jane and John Does who had waited in evidence lockers far longer than any of the 11 names in this file. It also forced a reckoning no one working the original case had anticipated. Genealogy databases built for people searching for lost relatives had quietly become one of the most powerful tools available to American law enforcement, and almost no one who used those services had agreed to that use in advance. GEDmatch has since changed its policy to require users to actively opt in before their profile can be searched by investigators. Several states, including Maryland, have passed legislation specifically restricting how and when forensic genetic genealogy can be used. And the broader question of where genetic privacy ends and public safety begins remains unresolved. Is a distant cousin's curiosity about their own ancestry a fair price for closing a case that law enforcement had abandoned decades earlier? The courts, the legislatures, and the genealogy companies are all still working out an answer, case by case, database by database, with no single ruling likely to settle it for good. You are still looking at that same case file. The 11 names inside it haven't changed. What changed is the name written beside them, the one the evidence had been pointing toward the entire time, and the exact record of how long it took anyone to finally listen.